Well, good evening and welcome to this Department of Education public seminar. Great to have your company and we look forward to an interesting discussion. Tonight we have with us Dr. James Robson. James is an Associate Director of the Centre for Skills, Knowledge and Organisational Performance, SCOPE, and Departmental Lecturer in Higher Education at Oxford University's Department of Education. James's research focuses on higher education policy, the intersection between education and work, employability, graduate labour markets, skills supply and demand, and research ecosystems. His research has been funded by an impressive list of funders, the AHRC, ESRC, GCRF, DFID, and if you know what all those initials mean, then you're on the inside of the research funding game, the British Academy, the Royal Society and the Edge Foundation, and includes a large-scale project examining humanities graduates' labour market outcomes, skills developed and deployed, and wider conceptualisations of the value of humanities degrees. So tonight we'll proceed with address from James, his lecture, and then we'll move to the Q&A. If you look on your screen, you'll find there's a Q&A button that you can use if you want to post your Q&A question. You can do that at any time during the speech if you want to write a question out then, and we can then consider it after the speech is finished, or of course you can enter the Q&A process during the Q&A section itself. I'd advise you though that if you do have a burning question, bring it forward as early as you can, because questions that come forward very late in the process can miss out. What we'll do is we'll assemble a Q&A section. Once James is finished, I'll pass the questions through to him and he will respond to them successively. So without any further delay, let me hand you all over to James.
Thanks, Simon. Let me just share my screen. Now, can you see that and hear me? Great. Well, thank you very much for that introduction. I'll just jump straight in. Now, I think it's very likely that the graduate labour market will be one of the key issues, if not the key issue, that will dominate policy and public discourse over the next few years. In the UK, the relationship between higher education and the world of work has, for at least the last 2 decades, been one of the key drivers of policy, shaping educational structures, institutional competition, governance, and student demand. At the moment, it's clear that concerns over the relationship between higher education and employment is the driving force behind the government's current focus on restructuring the tertiary sector. Now, the reality is that Covid-19 is going to expose fragility in the graduate labour market, and actually it's already doing this. In a few minutes, I'll go through some of the data on the challenges already being experienced by individuals and institutions, and we'll map out what I think is the trajectory here. However, perhaps more importantly, the pandemic comes at the same time as a number of other key issues facing society: the changing nature of work, the changing nature of business, and the climate crisis. These issues, combined with the coronavirus, don't just expose the fragility of graduate labour markets, they expose the fragility of the way in which the relationship between education and work has been traditionally conceptualised. Ever since, in the 1960s, human capital theory became the dominant ideology underpinning educational and employment policy. Therefore, in this talk, I'm going to try and do 4 main things. Discuss the implications of the COVID-19 pandemic and the subsequent recession on the graduate labour market. Discuss the wider changes in graduate jobs related to the changing nature of work, the changing nature of business, and more broadly, the challenge of climate change. Use these discussions to expose the fragility of the graduate labour market and the fundamental flaws in traditional theoretical and policy conceptualisations of the relationship between higher education and work. We'll particularly focus on linear conceptualisations of skill supply and demand rooted in human capital theory models that emphasise investment in learning, leading to increased earning due to labour scarcity. And fourthly, I'll tentatively discuss new ways of thinking about higher education and the labour market, and the need to shift our theoretical and policy lenses to take a job scarcity focus and re-emphasise the educational role of higher education. To do this, I'll draw on two empirical studies of the UK graduate labour market. Firstly, a project I led last year with Simon, Hewitt Keep, Emily Murphy, Nuzuna Saber and Alice Tall, examining Oxford Humanities graduates' labour market outcomes and experiences. Secondly, I'll draw on a project I'm currently undertaking with a colleague at Queen Mary's, Ben Holgate and Ashmita Randhawa from this department. This project is funded by the AHRC and is run through Scope, and is focused on examining narrative skills in business by interviewing CEOs and chairs from approximately a third of FTSE 100 companies. Both of these projects involved a careful analysis of the UK higher education and employment policy landscape and the nature and future of work, with one taking place before the current pandemic and one during it. I'll draw on these analyses for the presentation. Now, I'm aware that these aims are relatively ambitious and there's a lot to fit into a 45-minute presentation, so I hope you'll forgive me if at times I gloss over some of the finer grained detail in order to make a broader argument. I'm also aware that not everyone in the audience will be particularly familiar with some of the economic concepts that we'll discuss or how they underpin so much of higher education policy, so I'll briefly touch on human capital theory now. Now, apologies to those who are already familiar with these ideas, but in brief, although the idea of human capital theory or human capital had existed in economics for several centuries, going back to Adam Smith, human capital theory as it exists now was developed in the 1950s and 60s in America, and Gary Becker is largely seen as the father of the modern theory. Developments were driven by a resurgent interest in understanding the drivers of economic growth and the sudden availability of large data sets relating to workers' earnings, productivity, and education levels. In very simplistic terms, human capital theory assumes that individuals invest in education with the expectation that the investment will provide a benefit, usually in the form of higher earnings or overall well-being. Investment is seen as raising individual productivity, which leads to higher rewards. Education or training enhances skills, which makes workers more productive, which increases firms' outputs and profits, the value of which is reflected in financial rewards to the individual. At the same time, enhanced productivity drives economic growth. There are far more complicated ways of articulating the theory, but this simple idea has come to dominate both HE policy discourse and public debate. It underpins the discussions around who benefits from higher education and who should bear the cost, the focus on student labour market outcomes and the increasing reliance on these as a measure of teaching excellence, emphasis on higher education having value for money, and the current critique of low-value courses, i.e. courses with low financial returns for graduates. However, human capital theory is rooted in the principle of labour scarcity, the idea that there is not enough high-skilled labour in the jobs market, so individual investment in skills will automatically lead to high-skilled work and financial returns. Commentators have long been critical of this aspect of the theory, and we'll discuss this shortly and see how this is an issue that the current pandemic labour market shines a particularly bright light on. So, let's begin by examining the impact Covid-19 has had on the graduate labour market. There's little doubt now that the pandemic has had a huge global economic impact, and as far as the UK is concerned, we are in a deep recession. The Bank of England has referred to this as the worst recession in 300 years. This has had a devastating impact on the labour market. Looking at the most recent data released by the ONS last week, particularly labour force survey data focused on the last quarter, we can see from the graph at the top left of this slide that employment numbers have gone down significantly. Unemployment levels have gone up and economic inactivity levels are high. Since March, the number of workers on payrolls has dropped by around 750,000. The graph in the top right shows that redundancies have risen sharply in recent months and in the last quarter reached an all-time record of around 350,000. between July and September. This now exceeds the peak number of job losses in 2009. As indicated in the graph at the bottom, significant numbers of individuals are at risk of redundancy, such that the Institute of Employment Studies and other commentators are predicting that redundancies will go up to 450 to 500,000 in the next quarter. Looking at flows in and out of work, it's clear that these large reductions in employment numbers are driven both by more people leaving work and by fewer people finding work. The significant drop in the number of vacancies available clearly shows that the employment crisis is rooted in the state and structures of the labour market. Although there was a slight uptick in the number of vacancies in September, reflecting the initial growth in the economy after lockdown, it's very likely we'll see the numbers plummeting again to well below the 2008-9 figures. There are no big surprises here. The economy is in trouble and there aren't enough jobs. However, this all matters most for the youth population, defined in this country as 16 to 24-year-olds. Data from previous recessions have clearly shown that young people are always hit hardest in a constricted jobs market. And there is every indication that the UK is now teetering on the edge of a potentially long-term and entrenched youth unemployment crisis on a scale that hasn't been seen since the 1980s and may well exceed it. Labour force survey data clearly show that under 25s have experienced the largest falls in employment rates, with the number of young people in work down by 174,000, the worst level ever recorded. Labour force data is consistent with recent findings from the Resolution Foundation, which highlighted that young people were much more likely to have been made redundant at the beginning of this crisis, much more likely to be furloughed, and much more likely to lose their jobs once the furlough scheme in its initial form came to an end when compared with their older and more experienced colleagues. Similarly, a survey of 2,000 young people aged 16 to 25 across the UK, undertaken by the Prince's Trust in September, showed that 44% of respondents had lower aspirations for their futures, with 41% of young people believing their future goals were impossible to achieve. This rose to 50% for respondents from low socioeconomic status backgrounds. More than a quarter of the sample stated that they would take any job they could get, with nearly half stating that they expect to take lower paid work than they would have previously hoped to have gained given their educational levels, simply to make ends meet. Now, with 50% of young people in the UK going to university, a significant proportion of those in and entering the recession labour market are graduates. Although often assumed to have an employability advantage, graduates are already reporting significant difficulties in finding work, challenges with finding placements and internships, or having had interviews cancelled. Research on workplace access and graduate recruitment by the Sutton Trust showed that 46% of students say COVID-19 had made it harder for them to find a graduate job. 18% of graduates have experienced placements being cancelled or postponed. 11% had had interviews cancelled. 4% had had job offers withdrawn. And on the employer side of the research project, 61% of employers have cancelled some or all of their work experience placements this summer, particularly small and medium-sized employers. And 39% of employers reported they were likely to be hiring significantly fewer graduates or none at all over the next 12 months. This work was undertaken over the summer and published in July, by and large before the continued labour market contraction and at a time when many restrictions were still in place. So in all likelihood, before the majority of recent graduates would have started serious job hunting. There is every indication that data collected over the summer was an early snapshot of the graduate experience of the labour market. This is borne out by an autumn survey conducted by the Institute of Student Employers, which found that overall the number of graduate jobs declined by 12% in 2020, a figure which hides inequality across sectors, with employers in the retail and consumer goods sector cutting graduate recruitment by 45%. The majority of employers reported anticipating significant further cuts and importantly reported significant decreases, 29%, in internships and a 25% decrease in placements in 2019-20, with further falls expected, clearly increasing competition for entry into the employment pipeline. Given the significant reduction in vacancies, employers reducing intakes into graduate programs, and the fact that research has shown that youth populations always do worse in constricted labour markets when compared with older and more experienced job seekers, the graduate experience is very likely to be increasingly characterised by difficult transitions into work and periods of unemployment and underemployment, individuals taking on work that is low paid and low skilled that isn't consistent with traditional conceptualizations of graduate work. Based on our current analyses of the trajectories of travel, the lived reality for many graduates entering and engaging in the labour market in 2020 and 2021, and in all likelihood for a number of subsequent years, is likely to be characterised by competition for a small number of graduate level jobs and desperate attempts to make themselves more attractive through re- and upskilling, extending their credentials through additional postgraduate education, and gaining work experience through a variety of un- or poorly paid internships or other opportunities. Cultural and economic capital, institutional prestige, degree subject, work experience, skills developed at and after university, and institutional support in facilitating labour market transitions will all be major factors in individuals successfully navigating this contested space and gaining graduate level employment. Those that are unsuccessful in the graduate level jobs market will face competition in the congested wider youth labour market and may need to navigate the range of national support measures such as Kickstart scheme and an expansion of traineeships and apprenticeships. All these measures are likely to provide salaries well below pre-crisis graduate averages, and given the likely long-term nature of the youth unemployment crisis, congestion across the whole youth labour market will only increase as each new cohort of education leavers enters the jobs market. So why does any of this matter? Well, at an individual level, we know from recent research from the 2008 recession that university graduates entering the labour market in these conditions are likely to suffer long-term scarring. Experiencing challenges in gaining employment with periods of under and unemployment will significantly impact individuals' long-term career trajectories, lifetime earnings, and mental and physical well-being. For example, the 2008-9 recession produced a similarly constricted labour market to the current situation, with a reduction in vacancies across the board and increased competition for graduate and graduate level jobs. The cohorts of students graduating in 2008 and 2009 struggled on transitioning into work, and at an aggregate level have not achieved equivalent earnings or job satisfaction levels 10 years into their careers when compared with peers who graduated either side of the recession. This scarring appears to be linked to individuals experiencing challenges early on in their transition into the labour market, and a number of mechanisms have been suggested to explain the long-term impacts of this on individuals' careers. For example, signalling effects initial earnings have to employers marks individuals out as less productive. The limited amount of experiences individuals can gain in low-skilled work, experience of autonomy, management, responsibility, etc. are often key to gaining better paid or high-skilled work, and a slow and iterative decline of individuals' career aspirations in the face of obstacles and challenges. There can be little doubt that this economic scarring also has an impact on individuals' mental health and flattens intergenerational social mobility or even leads to downward mobility. Given the instability of the COVID-19 constricted labour market, and the significance of the current labour market challenges, it's very likely that we will see a COVID-19 generation of graduates covering several years with deep scars. However, critically, the challenges graduates experience within the pandemic labour market will not be felt equally. There will be winners and losers. Before the coronavirus, the graduate labour market was already unequal, with ease of transition from education into work, successful navigation of the labour market, immediate and long-term earnings, and job satisfaction, all linked with socioeconomic background, class, ethnicity, and gender, as well as the signalling influence of the prestige of the institution attended and variances across subjects taken. As has been repeatedly highlighted by researchers like Brown and Lauder, Friedman and Lorison, Rivera, and in our own study of Oxford graduates, elite employment is most often associated with graduates from elite institutions with strong professional social networks, cultural capital associated with professional classes, and sufficient familial wealth to gain usually poorly paid work experience in usually expensive cities. The challenging context of the pandemic labour market, where the number of graduate jobs is diminished and competition heightened, is very likely to exponentially deepen social, economic, and regional inequalities, leaving the most vulnerable groups exposed to short-term employment challenges and long-term economic, social, and health scarring. As already mentioned above, those that can, will, and should weather the economic storm within education. This is already apparent in record undergraduate numbers in the UK, even with the complexity around A-level results and the increased number of places that caused. Postgraduate education has seen similar increases in numbers, and although this might to a certain extent be a reflection of a higher education sector panicking at the potential loss of international students and over-recruiting to compensate for a predicted high number of offers not being taken up, it's clear that the demand from graduates for postgraduate education is there and likely still exceeds places available. It's very likely demand will increase and that this will accelerate a pre-existing trend of credential inflation. Commentators have been highlighting congestion in the graduate labour market for a number of years, often, as for example Keep and Mayhew have done, highlighting that the promise that a knowledge-based economy will lead to a rapid expansion in high-skilled, i.e. graduate level work, has not materialised. Using Trow's famous terms, as higher education systems at a global level increasingly move from elite to mass to universal, more and more graduates compete in a labour market that hasn't seen similar growth in high-skilled jobs. This congestion can be seen as having two main consequences. Firstly, underemployment or an overeducated workforce, depending on whether you discuss the issue at a micro or macro level. And secondly, signalling inflation. By this I mean an increasing need for individuals to distinguish themselves in a crowded jobs market through various forms of capital, usually different kinds of extracurricular activities, work experience, and additional credentials. Credential inflation can be seen not just in the dominance of ranking tables, but in an increasing number of individuals gaining additional postgraduate qualifications. Now, in a COVID-19 context, graduates will increasingly struggle to distinguish themselves from their peers through extracurricular activities and work experience. As highlighted already, reports are showing these opportunities ended rapidly as soon as the coronavirus hit, and few opportunities have emerged in a systematic way for the academic year of 2020-21. Therefore, an increasing number of individuals are likely to see a need to stand out from the crowd through postgraduate education. This, combined with an increasing number of individuals weathering the storm in postgraduate education, is highly likely to lead to a kind of hyperinflation in credentials. Although this will not affect all sectors or graduate roles, success in a competitive labour market may become increasingly linked with additional credentials. This can only further deepen inequalities. Many graduates from lower socioeconomic backgrounds will simply not be in a position to afford postgraduate education, and structural funding support is patchy at best. This is, of course, compounded by the fact that access to postgraduate education is also divided over social, economic, and ethnic lines, and the widening participation debate has been slow to engage with issues around academic and social reproduction beyond undergraduate levels. Now, the concept of the graduate labour market is controversial and definitions are slippery. I don't want to get too bogged down in definitions or debates around whether there really is such a thing as the graduate labour market at all, but it's important to emphasise that graduate jobs do not sit in a vacuum. They are part of a wider jobs market. Congestion in the high-skilled end of the jobs market usually leads to congestion further down the jobs hierarchy. Prudential hyperinflation is likely to increase the trend of labour segmentation. Those graduates who are unsuccessful in the most competitive graduate end of the labour market settle into underemployment and lower skilled, lower rewarded work. As discussed, this comes with long-term social, economic and personal scarring, but this also has consequences for individuals who would normally engage in less skilled labour, placing them in competition with graduates, a competition which data shows they are highly likely to lose. Congestion moves down. This leads to a gradual graduatisation of low-skilled work, such that employing graduates at this level becomes normalised, and then a degree becomes a requirement. This has two effects. Firstly, it drives credential inflation at all levels, further driving inequality, with those unable to access or afford a higher education suffering most in the jobs market. Secondly, it's very likely to push the least qualified and most vulnerable into unemployment or worse, economic inactivity. It may be that the current situation will see a shift from gradual graduatisation of work to rapid graduatisation of work and a sudden impact on the lower end of the labour market, pushing a large proportion of the most vulnerable into economic inactivity in one big hit. As I said, graduate labour markets are contextual, and winners usually create losers. This is not a new phenomenon, and concerns about massification and credential inflation have underpinned higher education policy discourse for a number of years. However, with predicted graduate scarring, accelerating credential hyperinflation and potential rapid graduatisation of low-skilled work, COVID-19 shines a very bright light on the inequalities and divisions in the labour market and in society more generally. Now, I want to say a few words about the implications of all of this for institutions, particularly as a way of further exploring some of the underlying assumptions related to the relationship between higher education, work and the economy. Unfortunately, there won't be time to talk about wider implications of the reduction of the graduate labour market for the state, other than highlighting the impending economic issue related to the mismatch between outgoing student loan payments and student loan repayments that will only become more pronounced as graduate financial returns are reduced and more graduates fail to repay their loans. Now, the implications for higher education institutions are complex. Aside from the probable issues around widening the gaps in prestige between institutions, universities face the question of how best to support their graduates transitioning into the labour market in a way that will alleviate the scarring effects. There is no clear answer to this, and it comes at a time when many institutions are struggling with finances, an overworked and depleted workforce, and the challenges of delivering courses online or using hybrid approaches. Pressure will be and already is being placed upon universities to support students in developing skills that will meet current labour market needs and provide courses that will meet skills gaps in the economy. This is where governmental and regulatory policy is focused, with pressure being exerted on institutions to ensure graduates have developed the skills to make them work ready and to provide more STEM courses to meet STEM skill shortages within the labour market. The announcement only last week by Secretary of State for Education, Gavin Williamson, of the foundation of the new Skills and Productivity Board with a focus on mapping out key gaps in skill supply is part of this policy drive. Similarly, the announcement today that the Universities UK is developing a charter to identify and improve low-value degree courses is part of this drive. However, there are several issues here that institutions face. Firstly, the issue that we can refer to as the curriculum dilemma. Higher education is finite. There is only so much time in a curriculum. Course designers and lecturers face the unreconcilable dilemma of attempting to decide what skills make a graduate work ready and fit them into a pressurized learning context. There is little agreement as to the definition of a work-ready graduate, and this clearly varies across sector and across type of employer. Some of the larger employers often want long-term employees, and so value skills that will remain relevant in the longer term for the duration of, or at least a significant part of, an individual's career. Other employers simply want to fill immediate skills gaps in their workforce and have an immediate requirement for skills which may not have longevity within the jobs market. While employers may want these skills, it is debatable whether universities are best serving their students by helping to form them, particularly when, as highlighted by Green and Hanseki, employers' increasing demands for job-ready graduates in part reflect cuts in their own investment in their employees' training. This has gone down by 60% since '97 in the UK. Institutions therefore face a critical dilemma around which skills should be included in a packed curriculum where, as recently argued by Ashwin, other key aims may need to take priority over employability skills. For example, ensuring students gain access to structured bodies of knowledge that transform their sense of who they are and what they can do in the world. Secondly, universities face what I've termed the experience paradox. As has been shown in a great deal of research, Shadbolt's examination of computer science degree skills, for example, and in both our recent and current studies of the graduate labour market, many skills that employers claim needed for their employees to be work ready and effective are in fact best developed in workplace settings rather than in formal education. Therefore, linear conceptualizations of skill, supply and demand, where education systems simply provide graduates with the skills demanded by employers, lack the nuance of reality and are largely rooted in a notion of skill stemming from simplistic understandings of human capital theory, where skills are equated all too readily with physical capital as simply another factor input within the black box of the firm. Thirdly, the primary issue facing students when they graduate into and try and navigate the Covid-19 labour market, or indeed any recession labour market, is not rooted in a mismatch of skill, supply and demand. It is fundamentally related to a lack of jobs. Therefore, putting policy focus on the supply side of the system, i.e. higher education institutions, to restructure and fill carefully mapped out skills gaps, I would argue, is the economic equivalent of fiddling while Rome burns. Now, however, this is an intersectional moment. Covid-19 is not the only issue in the labour market, or that's potentially reshaping our conceptualizations of the relationship between higher education and employment. As I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture, the nature of work is also changing. Rapid technological development, digital innovation, automation, and the growth of artificial intelligence are, in some sectors and occupations, changing the nature and structure of work, reframing skills demands and education and training provision, and remaking vocational and occupational identities. This reflects digitalization's influence on the shape of work organization, unbundling existing jobs, adding or subtracting new tasks and associated skill and knowledge requirements, and significantly reducing time spent on physical or routine tasks. It's very likely, at the same time as the clear contraction of the labour market brought about by Covid-19, the changing nature of work is likely to accelerate following lockdowns as organisations put in place digital solutions to maintain productivity. At a basic level, this can be seen in the growth in home working and an increasing focus on digital and communications related skills. However, shifts in the nature of work are more nuanced. Analysis of burning glass data, big data from global job adverts, has shown a significant increase in what is frequently referred to as hybrid jobs over the last 5 years. Jobs that combine skills that traditionally have rarely been found together, such as marketing and big data statistical analysis, or graphical design and programming. Hybridization is frequently linked with interdisciplinarity and complexities around skill formation, combining both technical and general skills and knowledge, which are increasingly likely to depend on both systematic education and robust workplace learning. Thus, As traditional models of work become increasingly disrupted, the relationship between skill supply and demand also becomes increasingly complex, and ideas of linear supply chains become increasingly problematic. At the same time, it's clear that ongoing changes in the nature of business have also been fundamentally accelerated by COVID-19. Something that is very clear from our current research is that business discourse is shifting from shareholder capitalism to stakeholder capitalism, moving beyond the economics of Friedman, where companies' main focus was conceptualized in terms of maximizing profit for shareholders. Discourse has shifted such that businesses must serve the needs of the whole of society, including customers, employees, suppliers, and communities, as well as their shareholders. This is stakeholder capitalism, where broad needs of a wide range of stakeholders must be central to a company's core purpose. A modern company must now act as an environmental steward, enhance diversity, promote equity, fairness, and justice, and ensure employee well-being. As such, businesses must now actively engage with societal issues such as climate change, social justice, gender equality, and anti-racism. The driving force behind this discursive change is inevitably complex, but can, in part at least, be traced to three key issues. Firstly, an increasing societal dissatisfaction with traditional narrow models of shareholder capitalism. Secondly, the climate crisis has highlighted the fundamental damage that a form of capitalism modelled only on maximising shareholder profits does to the world. And thirdly, as both our previous and current projects highlight, there is a growing intergenerational disconnect between what older generations and younger generations value in work. For recent graduates and current students, purpose and value of work is increasingly a more motivating factor than financial returns. They want to work in jobs that make a difference and for organisations that have a meaningful role to play in society. Thus, society as a whole and the incoming generation of employees are demanding a different way of conceptualising the economy, and, at least at a discursive level, businesses are responding. As the nature of business shifts, it is arguable that the relationship between education and the labour market must also redevelop and reconceptualise the idea of human capital in a way that is fit for the complexities and nuances of a values-driven, stakeholder-focused economy. In fact, we could take this one step further and argue that the traditional model of skill supply and demand, where higher education is seen as simply providing employers with graduates that meet their demands, is broken. Perhaps it's time for a new compact between higher education and the world of work, where higher education systems focus on producing graduates that society needs, graduates that will continue to drive changes in the economy and in business, not meeting current employer needs, but forcing employers to change to meet societal needs. Now, in some ways, this has been a slightly odd talk to deliver in an education department. I've talked a lot about the labour market, the demand side, very little about higher education, the supply side, certainly not with any nuance that reflects education as an embedded practice. However, what I've attempted to do is highlight what I think is a perfect storm in the economy and the labour market of COVID-19, the changing nature of work, the changing nature of business, and although I haven't been able to spend as much time discussing it as I would have liked, the climate crisis. Combined, I think these highlight the inherent fragility in the graduate labour market and the inherent fragility of current conceptualizations of the relationship between higher education and work. I believe graduates will experience significant challenges in gaining work over the next few years. We will see extensive graduate underemployment, rapid graduatization of low-skilled work, hyperinflation of credentials, and the most vulnerable slipping into economic inactivity, all of which will deepen and extend pre-existing social, cultural, racial, and geographic inequalities. The policy focus seems to be largely rooted in reshaping the supply side of the relationship between higher education and work. This is, at least in part, because of the dominance of human capital theory thinking. This assumes a labour scarcity and the view that investing in learning will always pay off in a context of endless high-skilled work. The current labour market clearly shows, as argued previously and recently by Brown et al., that the endless supply of high-skilled jobs promised by the knowledge economy has not come to fruition. There is not enough skilled work. There are high levels of underemployment and low levels of job satisfaction. There is a scarcity of jobs, not a scarcity of labour. More broadly, wage inequalities and labour market successes not only reflect differences in the value of individual skills, knowledge and credentials, but also the fundamental structures of the labour market and society in general. As such, viewing the problems facing graduate work through the lenses of labour supply, as dictated by human capital theory, does not appear to provide the appropriate tools for a set of problems rooted in a labour market issue. As Brown et al. Have recently argued, a jobs lens focused on job scarcity rather than a labour lens focused on assumed labour scarcity is required. COVID-19 has exposed this clearly. Globally, there are shifts in the direction of job scarcity focused policy, as illustrated by the exciting new Universal Jobs Guarantee Scheme, a global first, designed by colleagues in Oxford's Department of Social Policy and Intervention and run by the Austrian Public Employer Service. However, as I mentioned above, there is arguably now an imperative to rethink the relationship between higher education and work. Over the last few decades, the economic purposes of higher education have come to dominate the public and policy discursive landscape, but arguably we need to reassess and reprioritize the value of higher education in terms of its educational focus on bodies of knowledge and the contribution it makes to the quality of individual and social life. However, higher education is not divorced from the economy, and it's critical to maintain a focus on the relationship between skill supply and demand, but in a way that challenges simplistic narratives of skill accumulation and deployment, devoid of context and social structures, and linear supply chain models. Much has been said of building society back better in the wake of COVID-19, and by reconceptualizing skills as a force of change rather than a means of meeting current employer demands could be a vital way of achieving this. Now, perhaps before ending, I should address some of the weaknesses in my argument. I'll admit I'm painting a deliberately negative picture of the graduate labour market. I have discussed the COVID-19 labour market in deliberately negative terms in order to expose what I see as some of the fundamental flaws in current conceptualizations of skills systems and the relationship between education and work. I'm aware that certain career commentators are much more positive in their projections of the state of graduate work. However, although I'd love to be proved wrong and hope to be, unfortunately, I suspect the projections from this analysis are not going to be very far from the lived reality of many graduates. But regardless of the intensity of the issues facing graduates, I would like to argue that the perfect storm of COVID-19, the changing nature of work, the changing nature of business, and the climate crisis highlight a fundamental challenge to traditional models of thinking about education and work. However, importantly, they provide education in general and higher education specifically with the opportunity to revitalize itself as a force of societal and economic change. Rethinking notions of human capital and skills is critical to this. So thank you. I'll end there and hand back to Simon to field the questions.
Well, thank you, James. That was all embracing and very challenging and quite disturbing, but some positive ideas as well. You talked about the changing nature of business, you know, the notion of stakeholder rather than shareholder capitalism, the broader social obligation of business. Sounds like business might, on a good day, become more like government and more like universities in its broad range of functions. So two questions. I mean, one is, have you seen evidence of this kind of a new, what you might call the new business emerging at scale. And the other question is, what can policymakers, what can government do to advance this sort of broader agenda of stakeholder capitalism?
An excellent question. So the work that we've been doing with FTSE 100 companies, and we've actually talked to over a third of CEOs and chairs from FTSE 100 companies, has highlighted that this shift is very real at the senior leadership end of big business. I think it's permeating down through small and medium-sized enterprises. So that's clear evidence of this shift. And I think you only need to sort of do a general search on places like McKinsey to see just how frequently this shift is referred to now, and how it's actually tearing apart some of the business discourse as businesses try and catch up with some of these sort of shifting demands. In general, I think there is the potential for businesses to become much more holistic in their relationship with society and model or take on a governmental model. And I think that's probably a good thing. The issue that I think we have is perhaps that state and government hasn't yet sort of caught up with that shift in terms of its policy making in relation to the education system. So we still got this idea of a very linear model of skill supply to a shareholder capitalist model, as opposed to a broader and more open conceptualization of the skills required for this kind of new way of thinking, a new economic system.
So the new graduate could help develop the new business ethos, if you like, providing the new graduate had the opportunity to make that contribution. It's a transitional process, but I better move to the several Q&A questions we have now. Ashmita Ranwar has asked two questions, and I'm going to give them both to you, so you'll have the chance to respond to each. The second one, the longer one, says, does this mean, this is your argument, does this mean that HE, higher education, needs to consider a more interdisciplinary approach to some of its degrees, as is the case with many US degrees? Is that a model that could be explored more in depth here? Does that responsibility lie with higher education alone, or does it begin with a shake-up of secondary education as well? That's question one. So interdisciplinary approach to both secondary and tertiary. And Ashmita's other question is, do you think that government schemes such as Kickstart will help with the growing youth unemployment crisis?
Excellent. Yeah, two great questions. The interdisciplinary issue, I think, is complex. I think the hybridization of work leads to an assumption that interdisciplinarity is a good thing, and we've got the is it called the Interdisciplinary School in London, which is trying to provide a higher education experience more aligned with the sort of liberal arts education that goes on in America, where people don't specialize so quickly and get a sense of a variety of different disciplinary lenses. I'm not sure that that's necessarily a good thing. I do think that there's a lot of value to be had in depth of knowledge and being brought into structured ways of thinking that you get by focusing in on one discipline. The stage at which we should do that, I don't know. Perhaps we do specialize too early in this country, and we need a longer term approach to that. But I think there's an awful lot of really interesting thought going on this. And what we shouldn't do, I think, is necessarily be driven by the need to fill hybrid jobs. We should think about what is pedagogically best for students and what's best for students in the longer term. And it may be that this interdisciplinarity is a very good thing, and we should be including more of that in higher education curricula. But I think we actually need a more focused research project that looks at the supply side, looks at the education systems to engage with that. So I think that's probably the next stage of the process. In terms of Kickstart, I I have not got a lot of faith that that will be a solution to the youth employment crisis. I think that the Kickstart schemes and other interventions are based on the idea of a short-term unemployment crisis, and the thinking hasn't really been developed to focus on what will happen if youth unemployment becomes entrenched as it did in the 80s. There may be rounds and rounds of people going through Kickstart schemes, and I don't think that's been properly conceptualized. The other issue is that it seems to be tied to benefits, which will potentially lead to problems, and it doesn't really take into account the growing numbers of economically inactive individuals and young people. These people are very likely to just fall out of the system, with Kickstart being tied to, and in general, youth unemployment interventions being tied to benefits. Those who are not engaging with the benefits system, the economically inactive, will simply just fall out of that. And there doesn't seem to be any other initiatives to capture those people and bring them back into the system while helping them falling into crime or things like that. So, thanks.
Thanks, Ashmita, and thanks, James, for the answers. Lena Zlock has two questions also. The second question is, does the idea of digital natives play a role in how employers view potential youth employees? Millennials might be more disposed to working with and learning new technologies. So that's a new technologies question. And the other one was this, just a moment. Does the importance of management autonomy mean that internships or apprenticeships should become formal parts of degree work, so that students can gain experience before they enter the market with the support of their institution? So that's a question about internships and apprenticeships during study.
Yeah, two really good questions there. The digital native issue is it's a very hot topic. The concept of the digital native has been quite roundly critiqued, and our colleague in education and in the OII, Rebecca Einem, has written quite extensively about issues of the concept of the digital native, not really taking into account the digital divide. It's very dangerous for us to assume that all young people are experts at technology just because they're young people. So I'd be cautious of using that language. I do think there's intergenerational issues, as I tried to highlight in the talk, and that to some extent will be linked with different modes of communication. But I think what we have to avoid is taking a technological deterministic approach here and acknowledge that there are differences in all generations, and all people will have a different relationship with technology, and so we should be cautious. In terms of the issue of embedding internships into degree courses, yeah, I think this is a really important and interesting issue. I think lots of degree courses are trying to do this, and there is a drive towards that, which has been somewhat squashed by the current situation and the limitations that it places upon those opportunities. I think it's probably a really important issue to promote, actually, because some of our research on Oxford graduates highlighted a issue of hidden internships that individuals referred to, and by this I mean that in order to access elite jobs, they, on leaving university, took poorly paid jobs. Now, these aren't formal internships, they're basically just poorly paid jobs that are part of the pathway to a better paid job, a graduate level job. And this was particularly apparent in the creative industries and in marketing and advertising, where there is an assumption that one pays one's dues as a runner or as a tea maker, or just doing some sort of crap phone work. And there are only some people who can do those jobs. They're usually based in the city, in London or in Manchester, and places that are expensive to live, and pretty challenging for those from rural areas who are from lower socioeconomic backgrounds to actually afford to firstly move to those cities, which are expensive to live, and secondly take on that kind of low paid work for 1 or several years in order to access that pathway to that kind of job. So actually building proper mechanisms into the system, into the higher education system, would be very beneficial, I think, and would do something to alleviate that inequality, which, as far as I can tell, is not really properly acknowledged. There's a sort of blanket denial, I fear, that that's taking place on the levels that we found it taking place. So that is, I think, really important. But of course, there are curriculum issues. There is how much time should universities dedicate out of teaching core knowledge to finding those internships, finding those opportunities for their students. And that is a real challenge. And whether it should fall to tutors or lecturers is debatable. There probably needs to be a systematic partnership, or greater, and the partnerships do exist between careers advice centres and employers, but greater systematic partnerships to create those opportunities.
Got some great late questions coming in, as is always the way, but I think I should give you Olga Munn's questions. She's asked two, and they're about the intersection between the national labour market and its problems and the international dimension. Are you looking at graduate employment of British citizens or also international students who studied in the UK? Are you just looking at the British citizens, or are you looking at everyone? And that includes, of course, the relationship between immigration policy and post-study work visas and so on, and employability. And what are you looking at the employability of students with British HE degrees abroad?
Yeah, really good questions. Really good questions, and absolutely critical issues, given just how hot the topic of student mobility is. The answer is, for this paper and the studies that we're doing, we are focusing on the UK, and so are not analysing that international mobility issue. But I think it's worth saying that the Covid-19 context is reshaping that idea of flow and where students are getting jobs. And so what we're probably seeing is UK students who are educated abroad, who might have stayed abroad, coming back and putting pressure on the UK jobs market, and the inverse happening. So lots of students who are educated in the UK and may spend 1 or 5 years or maybe whole careers in the UK subsequently, are now moving back to their home countries and putting pressure on their jobs markets. So there's this sort of really interesting contraction and compression, and flows are changing quite significantly. And I do think that we need to be collecting data in a really systematic way on this. And I think that actually that's a really good thing to hammer home here, that we need much more research on this. Too much COVID-19 research funding is focused on the medical issues, and that's really important, clearly, but we need to get into the educational and higher educational issues too now as well, and start collecting data on this before it gets too late and gets lost.
Yes. Now we're reaching the end of our time. In fact, we have reached it, but I'm going to give you 2 more questions and ask you to be economical in your answers. One of them I think you can probably answer fairly briefly, and then we'll close. We're allowed to cheat a little bit with the 6 o'clock deadline. KCU is asking, You mentioned that in the wake of this pandemic, universities will be expected to engage in the reskilling and upskilling of the labour force. It seems that the incentives for universities to do so are not very high, apart from the tuition fee mechanism, which presumably could also be obtained through increasing normal enrolment. If that's the case, should government step in and subsidise the universities for their efforts in reskilling and upskilling? And Astrid Favela is asking, do you think that in this context, the initiatives of active security in flexicurity policies in the labour market entailing reskilling for the economically inactive are doomed to fail? That's
wow.
The longer one.
Well, it's fantastic to have 2 questions from our students. So thank you very much. And these are 2 really, really good and big questions. I'll answer them briefly, and we can unpack them more at another date. The incentivization is an interesting one. I read I can't remember where it was, an article today, but yes, I can't remember where it was, but which highlighted and compared the way in which the business minister communicated with CBI and the way in which our universities minister communicates with the higher education sector. The collegiate language that you have in the business context is gone in the higher education context. We have a sort of much more dictatorial, for want of a better word, language. So rather than kind of incentives, we have a stick being used. I think there are financial sticks, there are different approaches to this, but we see pressure being exerted through policy discourse, through governance mechanisms, through league tables, as well as, of course, through discussion around fees. But I think the announcement by Universities UK that I referred to earlier, which came out today, that they're starting a task force to look at low value degrees, is part of this move. It's part of the sort of soft power and soft exertion on the university sector. So I think that's the kind of way in which influence is played out, and incentivization, incentives are few in this context. Whether flexi approaches are doomed to fail is an excellent question, and the positive part of me says absolutely not. We should try, but as you'll have seen from my analysis of the labour market and my discussion of interventions, I'm not that positive when it comes to these issues. I'm a pessimist. So I suspect that we will probably see, if not outright failures, but challenges on the way.
Well, James, thank you very, very much. I mean, I think this is a great lecture, and I do hope you're going to publish it in some form soon. It's very publishable because you covered so much ground so well. It's nuance and depth, but you know, it's a hard message too. I mean, I'm struck by your positive message that graduates can help lead a transformation of work and society and approaches to many things, from the climate change to the nature of organisations and their social responsibilities. That's the positive possibility. And then there's the shadow that hangs over all of this. That term you use, job scarcity. We must acknowledge the problem on the demand side. That's crucial. That's going to cruel the futures of many people from the top to the bottom of the youth labour market, all affected. And addressing that problem seems critical. And we're not much further forward yet on how that might be done. But it's a topic for perhaps for another day, for another lecture. But thanks, James. Let me invite all those who are tuned in to return on the 23rd of November, 1 week's time, for another Department of Education public seminar at 5 o'clock on the 23rd, which will focus on the Spanish education system. We've got Professor Montserrat Gomendio from CSIC, which is the Spanish National Research Council, who will talk to us about recent measures of the performance of the Spanish education system, and she will raise some criticisms and some questions and doubts about the way in which the Spanish system is currently understood, and will talk to us about the relationship between equity and excellence. So we look forward to that, and until then, be safe, have a productive week, and thanks again, James, and we'll see you all next week. Bye then.